This chart shows the distribution of global economic output in the 15th and 16th centuries. Before European ships dominated the oceans, India was the engine of world commerce, producing roughly 1/4 of the globe's entire GDP. That massive wealth came from a global demand for incredibly high-quality manufactured goods. Look at the intricate patterns of this Indian chintz fabric. Textiles like these, along with spices and precious gems, were prized commodities across Europe and Asia. European merchants faced a major obstacle in acquiring these items. Arab and Ottoman intermediaries controlled the overland routes, which drove up prices and heavily cut into European profits. In 1498, Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama sailed around the tip of Africa to the Indian coast, establishing the first direct maritime connection. Over the next century, global trade shifted towards seafaring European empires, hungry for a direct cut of India's wealth. In 1600, a group of English merchants sought their own share of the market. They secured a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I to establish a monopoly on Eastern trade, calling themselves the English East India Company. When these British traders arrived, they were heavily outmatched. The Mughal Empire was at the height of its power. Company agents spent decades petitioning the emperor for firmans, imperial decrees, to secure basic permission to trade on the coast. They also faced fierce competition from other Europeans. The Portuguese already controlled key ports with their heavy warships, and the French were busy forging strong political alliances with local rulers. At this stage, the British were just a small corporation seeking a foothold, yet this group of merchants would eventually rule the entire subcontinent. By the 18th century, the central authority of the Mughal Empire began to fracture. As regional kings declared independence and the French backed local rulers to gain an edge, the British began intervening in Indian politics to protect their profits. At the 1757 Battle of Plassey, company official Robert Clive bypassed a direct military confrontation by bribing the Nawab's top commander, Mir Jafar. Mir Jafar's defection ensured a British victory before the main forces ever engaged. 7 years later, after winning the Battle of Buxar, the company extracted the ultimate prize from the weakened Mughal emperor, Diwani rights. This granted the company the legal authority to collect tax revenue across Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha. Firm, a profit-driven foreign corporation, now possessed the legal authority of a sovereign state, armed with a military force to extract wealth directly from the Indian population. Total war is expensive, so the company devised cheaper methods to absorb Indian kingdoms. In 1798, Lord Wellesley introduced the Subsidiary Alliance. The system was a trap. Indian rulers were told the British would protect them, but in exchange, the ruler had to pay for a permanent British military garrison on their land and hand over all foreign policy decisions to a British resident. True independence vanished. Later, the British created a secondary legal loophole called the Doctrine of Lapse. If an Indian ruler died without a natural-born male heir, the company ignored local adoption traditions and annexed the kingdom entirely. By the mid-19th century, these tactics had swallowed massive portions of the subcontinent. The British used weaponized contracts to strip Indian royalty of their sovereignty while maintaining a facade of local rule, avoiding the immense costs of direct conquest. With political control secured, the economic extraction accelerated. Under the drain of wealth, Indian tax revenues were no longer spent locally to build infrastructure or support agriculture. That wealth was instead shipped to London to help finance the British Industrial Revolution. At the same time, colonial trade policies heavily taxed Indian manufactured goods entering Britain, while forcing India to accept cheap British factory products. This deliberate deindustrialization ruined generations of highly skilled traditional weavers. During the 1770 Bengal famine, the company maintained its rigid tax collection targets even as the population died by the millions, turning a natural crop failure into an administrative disaster. The colonial administration selectively applied free market directives to maximize returns. During massive famines, traders exported large quantities of Indian grain out of the country for profit, while locals starved. This systematic exploitation sparked immediate resistance. Displaced tribal communities launched violent uprisings to protect ancestral lands, and peasant farmers rioted against forced indigo cultivation. By 1857, these fractured resistances ignited into a massive revolt. Triggered by sepoy religious grievances among soldiers, the Great Rebellion quickly united peasants, mercenaries, and civilians across northern and central India against the company. Displaced royal figures, whose kingdoms had been annexed by the doctrine of lapse, joined the fight. Leaders like Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi took to the battlefield to defend their lost territories. The 1857 rebellion unified decades of economic, political, and cultural grievances across all levels of society, transforming a series of local protests into a massive challenge to British authority. The British military eventually suppressed the rebellion. The shock of the uprising, however, forced London to act, and the English East India Company was completely dissolved. In 1858, the British Crown took formal control of the subcontinent, initiating the era of the British Raj. Under direct rule, the British built thousands of miles of railway lines and telegraph networks across the land. While often framed as a civilizing gift, this infrastructure was paid for by Indian taxpayers. The train lines designed specifically to move raw materials to the ports for export and to rapidly deploy military troops to crush future uprisings. The establishment of British rule oversaw the dismantling of a global manufacturing center through systematic corporate extraction. By the time independence arrived a century later, India's share of world GDP had collapsed from 25% to less than 4%.